Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The inverted spectrum problem. What if your red looks like my blue? Two people stand before a ripe tomato, and both say the tomato is red. Both use the word correctly. Both learned colour terms in the same way, by being shown red objects and hearing the word red. And their colour vision is normal. Their eyes and brains function identically. And yet the question arises, do they see the same colour? Does the tomato produce the same subjective experience in both? Or could it be that what one person experiences as red, the other experiences as blue? That their colour experiences are inverted, their spectrums reversed, and yet because they learned language the same way, because red things produce the same relative patterns, they both call the same things red, and have no way of discovering that their experiences differ. And this is the inverted spectrum problem. A thought experiment that has troubled philosophers since Locke. A puzzle about whether subjective experiences are private, whether they could differ between people in ways that behavioural and physical evidence cannot detect, and whether such differences would matter, whether they would mean anything if they are undetectable in principle. Imagine spectrum inversion more precisely. Person A sees red things as having the experience that person B has when seeing blue things, and person A sees blue things as having the experience person B has when seeing red, and this inversion is systematic, extends across the entire spectrum. Green is inverted with purple, orange with indigo, and so on. And both people learned colour words by associating them with the experiences they actually have. So person A learned to call things red that produce the blue experience, and person B learned to call things red that produce the red experience, and their language use is identical, their behaviour indistinguishable, and the inversion is undetectable from the outside, cannot be discovered through any behavioural test, through any physical measurement, through any scientific investigation, because all the objective facts are the same, only the subjective experiences differ. The inverted spectrum problem raises questions about the privacy of qualia, about whether subjective experiences are essentially first personal, accessible only to the person having them, and if spectrum inversion is possible, then qualia are private, are not reducible to anything public or objective, because two people with inverted spectrums have different qualia despite having identical physical states and identical behaviours. And this challenges functionalism, challenges the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by their patterns of causes and effects, because inverted spectrums have the same functional roles, but different experiential qualities, and so functional role does not determine qualia, does not exhaust the nature of conscious experience. Visualize the problem as a question about the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience. The same physical processes, the same wavelengths of light, the same retinal responses, the same neural firings produce different experiences in inverted people, red experience versus blue experience. And this suggests that experience is not determined by physical processes alone, that there is something additional, something that could vary even when physical processes are fixed. And this something is what philosophers call qualia, the intrinsic experiential qualities of mental states. The what, it is likeness, and the inverted spectrum problem shows, or claims to show, that qualia are real, are distinct from physical and functional properties, are private and subjective. One response to the inverted spectrum problem denies that spectrum inversion is possible, argues that colour experiences are tied to their functional roles, to how they affect behaviour and other mental states, and systematic inversion would require inverting all these connections, would require changing not just colour experiences, but all the associations and reactions and emotions connected to colours. And once all these changes are made, the supposedly inverted person no longer has genuinely inverted experiences, but has the same experiences in a different functional network. And genuine inversion, preserving all functional roles while changing only qualia, is impossible, is incoherent, and the thought experiment fails because it describes an impossible scenario. Another response accepts that spectrum inversion is possible, but argues that it does not threaten functionalism or physicalism, because if inversion is undetectable in principle, then it is not a real difference, not a difference that matters, and science is concerned with objective differences, with differences that make a difference to behaviour or physical processes, and subjective differences that have no objective manifestation are not the kind of things science needs to explain, are not part of the natural world that science investigates. And so the inverted spectrum problem, even if it shows that qualia are private, does not show that they are non-physical, only that they are aspects of physical states that science does not need to characterize in its theories. A third response appeals to the ecological theory of perception, argues that colour experiences are not arbitrary inner states, but are shaped by the environment, by what colours signify, by their natural and biological meanings. And red looks the way it does because of its associations with blood, fire, ripe fruit, danger, and these associations are grounded in evolutionary history, in universal human experiences, and systematic inversion would disrupt these associations, would make red look restful and blue look alarming, and this would be detectable, would affect behaviour, and so genuine spectrum inversion, preserving all functional roles, including emotional and associative roles, is impossible. The inverted spectrum problem also connects to the problem of other minds, because if spectrum inversion is possible, then we cannot know what other people experience, cannot know whether their red is our red or our blue, and this creates a kind of skepticism, a recognition that subjective experience is essentially private, is not fully accessible to others, and while we can know what people say about their experiences, what behaviours they exhibit, we cannot know what they actually feel, what their experiences are like from the inside. And this privacy is both troubling and profound, suggests that each person's consciousness is a private world, knowable fully only to themselves. Some philosophers argue that the inverted spectrum problem trades on confusion about the nature of colour experience, that colours are not simple intrinsic qualities, but are defined by their relationships to other colours, to contexts, to perceptual constancies, and that inverting these relationships is not coherent, not a genuine possibility, and that the thought experiment misleads us by treating colours as if they were simple atoms of experience that could be swapped without affecting anything else, when in fact colour experience is holistic, is embedded in networks of perception and cognition, and cannot be varied independently. Others embrace the inverted spectrum problem, argue that it reveals important truths about consciousness, that qualia are real, are private, are not reducible to functional or physical properties, and that any theory of consciousness must accommodate this, must allow for the possibility that physically and functionally identical beings could differ in their subjective experiences, and this supports property dualism, supports the view that phenomenal properties are additional to physical properties, are aspects of reality that physical science cannot capture. The two people stand before the tomato, both calling it red, and the question lingers, do they see the same thing? Do their experiences match? Or does one see what the other would call blue? And there is no way to tell, no test that reveals the truth, and the privacy of experience persists. The possibility that our inner worlds differ in ways we cannot communicate, in ways language cannot capture, and the inverted spectrum problem remains, not solved, not refuted, not accepted, but persistent as a challenge to theories of mind, as a thought experiment that probes the nature of subjective experience, as a question about whether qualia are private, whether consciousness has aspects that resist objective description, and whether the inner life of another person is truly accessible or forever hidden behind the veil of their behaviour and their words. And the tomato remains red, called red by both, but whether they see the same red, whether their experiences converge or diverge behind the labels, remains uncertain, remains one of the enduring mysteries about the nature of consciousness and the privacy of subjective experience. The knowledge argument, what the colour scientist learns when she leaves her room. A scientist named Mary spends her entire life in a black and white room, a room devoid of colour, where everything is shades of grey. And Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who specialises in colour vision, and she studies colour from this colourless room using black and white monitors and books. And she learns everything physical there is to know about colour, learns about wavelengths and photoreceptors and neural pathways, learns about opponent processing and colour constancy, knows exactly which brain states correspond to which colour experiences, can predict with perfect accuracy what someone will report when shown a coloured object. And Mary's knowledge of the physical facts about colour is complete, exhaustive, includes every fact that physics, chemistry, and neuroscience can provide. And yet Mary has never seen colour, has never experienced red or blue or yellow. And then one day, Mary leaves the room, steps outside, and sees a ripe tomato for the first time. And she experiences red. And philosopher Frank Jackson asks, does Mary learn something new? Does she gain new knowledge when she sees red for the first time? And the intuition is yes. She learns what red looks like, learns what it is like to experience red. And this new knowledge is not physical knowledge, because she already had all physical knowledge. And so there are facts about consciousness, facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts. And physicalism is false. And this is the knowledge argument, also called the Mary argument, one of the most influential arguments against physicalism, a challenge to the view that the physical facts exhaust all facts. Imagine Mary's situation, surrounded by books and papers explaining colour in physical terms. She knows that red light has wavelengths around 700 nanometers, knows that it activates long wavelength cones in the retina, knows the neural pathways from retina to visual cortex, knows which patterns of neural firing correspond to red experiences, and she can answer any questioner about the physics and neuroscience of colour, can predict how people will react to colours, what they will say, how their brains will respond. And yet when she sees red for the first time, she says, aha, so that is what red looks like. And this reaction suggests she learned something, gained knowledge she did not have before. And since she already knew all physical facts, the new knowledge must be non-physical, must be knowledge of phenomenal facts, of what experiences are like. And these phenomenal facts are not reducible to physical facts, are additional to them. And so physicalism is incomplete, fails to capture everything about consciousness. The knowledge argument can be formulated as follows. Mary knows all physical facts about colour vision before leaving the room. When Mary leaves the room and sees red, she learns something new. Therefore, there are facts about colour vision that are not physical facts. And this conclusion supports property dualism, supports the view that conscious experiences have phenomenal properties that are not physical properties, that the subjective character of experience is something over and above the objective physical facts. And the argument challenges physicalist theories of mind, challenges the claim that neuroscience can give complete knowledge of consciousness, suggests that first-person subjective experience involves aspects that third-person objective science cannot capture. Visualize the two kinds of knowledge. On one side is Mary's complete physical knowledge, all the objective facts about colour, the facts that can be stated in scientific language, measured by instruments, predicted by theories. And on the other side is phenomenal knowledge, knowledge of what red looks like, knowledge that can only be acquired through experience, through having the experience oneself. And the knowledge argument says, These two kinds of knowledge are distinct, that no amount of the first kind can yield the second kind, and this distinctness shows that phenomenal facts are not physical facts, that consciousness has properties that resist physical reduction. Physicalists have developed multiple responses to the knowledge argument. The ability hypothesis argues that what Mary gains when she leaves the room is not new factual knowledge, but new abilities. The ability to recognize red, to imagine red, to remember red. And abilities are not facts, are know-how rather than know that. And so Mary's gain does not show that there are non-physical facts, only that physical knowledge does not automatically confer all abilities. And this response distinguishes knowing facts from having abilities, treats phenomenal knowledge as a kind of skill rather than propositional knowledge. The acquaintance hypothesis argues similarly that Mary gains acquaintance with red, becomes directly related to the experience of red in a way she was not before. But this acquaintance is not knowledge of new facts, it is a new way of knowing old facts, a new mode of presentation of facts she already knew. And so the knowledge argument fails because what Mary gains is not new knowledge, but new acquaintance. An acquaintance with experiences is compatible with physicalism does not show that there are non-physical facts. The old fact, new guys response argues that Mary learns no new fact but learns an old fact in a new way, learns about the physical property of experiencing red by having that experience, whereas before she only knew about it through descriptions and theories. And the same fact, the physical fact about red experiences, can be grasped in different ways, through theoretical knowledge or through direct experience, and Mary's situation involves gaining a new mode of access to old facts, not gaining access to new facts, and so the argument does not refute physicalism. Another response denies the key intuition, argues that Mary does not learn anything new when she leaves the room, that she already knew what red looks like from her complete physical knowledge. That complete physical knowledge includes phenomenal knowledge, and our intuition to the contrary is mistaken, is based on underestimating what complete physical knowledge would include. And if Mary truly knew everything physical about colour, then she would be able to deduce what red looks like, would already have phenomenal knowledge. And so the argument's premise is false. The knowledge argument also raises questions about the relationship between different kinds of knowledge, between theoretical and experiential knowledge, between objective and subjective perspectives, and whether these can be integrated, whether science can accommodate first-person phenomenal facts. And Jackson himself later rejected the knowledge argument, became a physicalist, argued that the knowledge Mary gains is not knowledge of new facts but is compatible with physicalism, though other philosophers continue to defend the argument, continue to insist that Mary's gain shows the incompleteness of physical accounts of consciousness. Mary sits in her black and white room, learning about colour, mastering every physical fact, and then she steps outside, and the world bursts into colour, and she sees red for the first time, and the tomato glows in the sunlight, and her reaction is wonder, is discovery, is the sense of learning something utterly new, and whether this reaction reveals that physicalism is false, that consciousness includes non-physical properties, or whether it merely shows that knowledge comes in different forms, different modes, remains disputed, remains one of the central debates in philosophy of mind, and the knowledge argument persists, powerful and controversial, a challenge to physicalist theories, a defense of the irreducibility of phenomenal consciousness, and a reminder that subjective experience, the what it is likeness of mental states, resists capture in purely objective physical terms, and Mary's story continues to be told, to be analysed, to be debated, and the question remains, did she learn something new, something that physical knowledge could not provide? And the answer determines whether consciousness can be fully explained by neuroscience, or whether phenomenal experience involves something more, something that transcends the physical. And the knowledge argument endures as a vivid illustration of the explanatory gap, the gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts, between brain and mind, between what we can know objectively and what we can only know by experience. The liberal paradox, when freedom and choice destroy each other. An economist named Amartya Sen constructs a paradox about individual liberty and social choice, about whether societies can simultaneously respect individual freedom and satisfy basic welfare criteria. And the paradox goes as follows. Suppose society values individual freedom, values the principle that each person should be decisive over certain personal matters, should have sovereignty over a domain of choices, perhaps what to wear or what to read or how to live, and call this principle minimal liberalism, the requirement that each individual has at least one pair of alternatives where their preference determines social choice. And now suppose society also values Pareto efficiency, values the principle that if everyone prefers outcome A to outcome B, then society should choose A, should not choose an outcome that makes everyone worse off. And Sen proves that these two principles are incompatible, that no social decision procedure can guarantee both minimal liberalism and Pareto efficiency, that respecting individual freedom can conflict with respecting unanimous preferences. And this is the liberal paradox, also called the impossibility of a Paretian liberal, a demonstration that liberal values contain internal tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that respecting individual choice over personal matters can lead to outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And the paradox has generated enormous literature, has sparked debates about the nature of rights, about whether rights are absolute or can be traded, about how to resolve conflicts between liberty and welfare, and the liberal paradox remains one of the most important results in social choice theory, remains a challenge to liberal political philosophy. Imagine a specific example. Two people, call them Prude and Lude, and a book, and Prude prefers that no one read the book, finds it offensive, would be most satisfied if neither reads it. And second best for Prude is if Prude reads it rather than Lude reading it, because at least then Prude can argue against it from first-hand knowledge, and worst for Prude is if Lude reads it while Prude does not. And Lude has opposite preferences, most prefers that Prude read the book, because Lude thinks Prude needs liberalising. Second best for Lude is that Lude reads it, and worst is that neither reads it. And now apply minimal liberalism. Say that Prude should be decisive over whether Prude reads the book, should have the right to choose for themselves, and Lude should be decisive over whether Lude reads the book, and Prude chooses not to read, exercises their right, and Lude chooses to read, exercises their right, and the outcome is Prude does not read and Lude reads, but both prefer the outcome where Prude reads and Lude does not. Both rank that outcome higher, and so the liberal outcome, the outcome that respects individual rights, violates Pareto efficiency, produces an outcome that both prefer to avoid, and the paradox emerges, respecting rights produces an outcome that unanimous preferences reject. The liberal paradox demonstrates that rights and welfare can conflict, that giving individuals control over personal matters can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And this challenges the assumption that liberalism is coherent, that respecting freedom always improves welfare. And Sen's paradox shows that this is false, shows that freedom and welfare can diverge, that societies face trade-offs between respecting rights and respecting preferences, and different resolutions prioritize differently. Some prioritize rights and accept that Pareto improvements may be blocked, accept that unanimous preferences may be overridden by individual sovereignty, and other resolutions prioritize welfare and accept that rights may be violated when everyone would benefit, and neither resolution is fully satisfying. Both involve accepting tensions within liberal values. Visualize the paradox as revealing a cycle. Individual rights produce an outcome, unanimous preferences reject that outcome and prefer an alternative, but that alternative violates individual rights, and we are stuck cannot satisfy both rights and preferences simultaneously. And this cycle shows that liberalism contains contradictions, that its commitments can conflict, and resolving the conflict requires prioritizing, requires deciding whether rights or welfare is more fundamental, and different liberal theories answer differently. Rights-based liberalism prioritizes rights and accepts welfare losses. Welfare-based liberalism prioritizes welfare and accepts rights violations, and no theory satisfies both perfectly. One response to the liberal paradox argues that the problem is with the specification of rights, that the rights in Sen's example are meddlesome, are concerned with what others do, and proper rights are self-regarding, are concerned only with what you do, not with what others do. And if rights are limited to self-regarding matters, then the paradox may not arise, then respecting rights may be compatible with Pareto efficiency. And this response requires distinguishing between self-regarding and other regarding preferences, between preferences about your own life and preferences about others' lives. And liberalism protects the former, but not the latter, and this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of rights, by denying that Prude has a right to prevent Lude from reading, even if Prude prefers that outcome. Another response accepts the paradox, accepts that rights sometimes block Pareto improvements, and argues that this is acceptable, that rights are constraints on social choice, are not mere preferences to be aggregated, but are protections that cannot be violated, even for welfare gains. And this deontological response treats rights as absolute, as trumps over welfare, and accepts that respecting rights may produce outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And this response is consistent with rights-based liberalism, with the view that individual freedom is foundational, is not negotiable, and welfare considerations cannot override rights. And the paradox is accepted as showing the cost of rights, showing that freedom has trade-offs. A third response questions the Pareto principle, argues that unanimous preferences should not always be respected, that preference satisfaction is not always good. And in Sen's example, the preferences are meddlesome, are concerned with interfering in others' choices, and perhaps such preferences should not count, should not be given weight in social choice. And this response modifies the Pareto principle to exclude meddlesome preferences, to respect only preferences about self-regarding matters. And this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of preferences that matter for social choice. And this approach has some support, has intuitive appeal, because it seems wrong to let people's preferences about others' private behaviour determine social outcomes, seems to give too much weight to intolerance or judgment. The liberal paradox also connects to debates about paternalism, about whether societies should prevent people from making choices that harm themselves, and paternalism violates minimal liberalism, overrides individual choice for welfare reasons, and the paradox shows why such overriding might be tempting, shows that respecting choice can produce outcomes that the chooser prefers to avoid, and this creates pressure toward paternalism, toward intervention, but liberalism resists, maintains that individual choice must be respected even when it leads to regret. And the tension between respecting choice and promoting welfare is permanent, is built into liberal theory, and the paradox makes it explicit. Some argue that the liberal paradox is merely theoretical, is unlikely in practice, requires specific preference structures that rarely occur, and empirical investigation of whether such structures exist would be valuable, but regardless of frequency, the paradox is important as a logical possibility, as a demonstration that liberal principles can conflict. And this shows that liberalism requires trade-offs, requires balancing competing values, and political philosophy must grapple with these trade-offs rather than assuming that liberal values are always compatible. The paradox also raises questions about whether societies should recognize rights at all, whether individual sovereignty over personal matters is justified if it can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And consequentialists might use the paradox to argue against rights, to argue that social choice should be based on welfare alone, without constraints from individual rights. But most find this conclusion extreme, find that rights are valuable despite potential conflicts with welfare, and the challenge is to specify rights carefully, to balance rights and welfare, to create institutions that respect both as much as possible, while recognizing that perfect compatibility is impossible. Prude and Lude exercise their rights, make their choices, and the outcome satisfies liberal principles, but violates Pareto efficiency, and both prefer an alternative, but that alternative requires violating someone's rights, requires overriding someone's choice, and the paradox stands unresolved, showing that liberalism contains tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that rights and preferences can diverge, and the liberal paradox endures as one of the important impossibility results in social choice theory, as a challenge to liberal political philosophy, as a demonstration that liberal values are not perfectly compatible. And the paradox remains a permanent feature of liberal theory, requiring careful navigation, requiring trade-offs between competing values, and showing that coherent liberalism is more complex than it appears. The McGurk effect. Why seeing changes what you hear. A person watches a video of someone speaking, sees their lips move, hears sounds, and perceives speech, but something strange occurs. The auditory signal says one thing, the syllable baha, and the visual signal shows lips making a different movement, the movement for ga, and yet what the person hears is neither ba nor ga, but da, a fusion of the two inputs, a compromise between hearing and vision. And this is the McGurk effect, discovered by psychologist Harry McGurk in 1976, a robust illusion showing that speech perception is multimodal, integrates auditory and visual information, and vision can alter what you hear, can change the perceived phoneme, even though the auditory input remains constant and the effect is automatic, is unconscious, occurs even when you know it is happening, and closing your eyes restores the original bar sound, showing that vision was modifying auditory perception, and the McGurk effect reveals that perception is not modality specific, but is multimodal, that different senses interact, that seeing influences hearing and hearing influences seeing, and perception is a unified process that integrates information from multiple sources. And this has implications for theories of perception, for understanding consciousness, and for recognizing that sensory modalities are not separate channels, but are interconnected systems that jointly construct perceptual experience. Imagine experiencing the effect, watching a video where someone's lips move saying ga while the audio plays ba, and you hear da, not what was said, not what the lips showed, but a fusion, and you know the audio is bea, can check by closing your eyes, but when your eyes are open you hear da, vision overrides audition, changes what you hear, and the effect is involuntary, is not something you can turn off. Perception integrates the inputs automatically, and this integration occurs before consciousness, before you become aware of the sound, and what reaches awareness is already a fusion, already combines hearing and seeing, and you cannot access the separate inputs, cannot hear bay and see gay separately, but only experience the integrated da. The McGurk effect demonstrates that speech perception is not purely auditory, not simply a matter of processing sound waves, but involves visual information about lip movements, facial gestures, speaker identity, and context. And the brain combines these sources, weighs them according to reliability, and produces a unified percept. And when visual and auditory information conflict, the brain compromises, produces a perception that splits the difference. And this compromise shows that perception is not just input-driven but is constructed, is the result of unconscious inference, of combining cues according to probabilities. And McGurk is an example where the inference goes wrong, produces a percept that does not match either input perfectly, but represents the brain's best guess, given conflicting information. Visualize the perceptual system as Bayesian, as computing probabilities based on sensory inputs and prior expectations. And when you see lips saying gyar and hear br, the brain computes that die is most likely given that visual and auditory cues are both somewhat unreliable and the percept should compromise between them. And this Bayesian integration explains many perceptual phenomena, explains how the brain combines cues from different senses, weights them by reliability, and produces unified, coherent experience. And the McGurk effect is a case where the integration produces an incorrect result, but reveals the normal processing that usually works well, that usually integrates senses accurately. The McGurk effect challenges theories that treat senses as separate, that analyze vision separately from audition, that assume perception is modality-specific, and the effect shows that modalities interact. That perception is fundamentally multimodal, and this has led to theories of multisensory integration, to research on how the brain combines information from different senses, where in the brain this integration occurs, and what rules govern it. And the McGurk effect has become a paradigm case, a standard demonstration of multimodal perception used in countless psychology classes and research studies. The effect also has implications for understanding consciousness, because the fusion occurs before consciousness, occurs in processing that we do not have access to, and what we experience as the result of this processing is the fused percept, and we do not experience the separate auditory and visual inputs, do not have access to the processing that combined them, and consciousness receives only the output, only the unified percept, and this shows that much of perception is unconscious, is hidden from awareness, and conscious experience is constructed from unconscious processing, and the construction is so seamless that we do not notice it, do not realize that our experience is a synthesis rather than a direct recording of input. The McGurk effect appears in discussions of cognitive penetrability, because if perception is modular, if sensory systems are encapsulated, then one modality should not influence another. Vision should not alter what you hear, but the McGurk effect shows cross-modal influence, shows that perception is not strictly modular, that different sensory modules communicate and interact. And this qualifies strong modularity, suggests that while early sensory processing may be modular, later perceptual processing integrates across modalities, and perception as a whole is not modular but is interactive. And the McGurk effect is evidence for this interactivity, for perceptual systems that are not strictly separated but are interconnected. The effect also has practical implications for understanding speech perception in noisy environments, for designing hearing aids that take advantage of visual information, for developing virtual reality systems that create convincing multimodal experiences, and for understanding how perception can be manipulated, how illusions can be created through conflicting sensory cues. And the McGurk effect shows that perception is vulnerable to these manipulations, is not simply determined by physical input, but depends on how inputs are integrated. The person watches the video, hears da, knows the audio says bar, sees the lips say gar, and yet perceives da, a fusion that is none of the inputs but is the brain's compromise. And the McGurk effect persists, demonstrates multimodal integration, challenges modular theories, reveals unconscious perceptual processing, and stands as one of the most famous demonstrations in cognitive psychology. A simple effect that reveals deep truths about how perception works, how senses interact, how consciousness is constructed from unconscious processes, and the effect remains robust and automatic, a permanent feature of human speech perception, showing that seeing changes, hearing, that perception is unified, that the brain constructs experience from multiple sources, and the fusion continues. Da heard when ba was spoken, and gar was seen, and the McGurk effect endures. The ontological paradox, why existence itself is impossible. A philosopher asks the most fundamental question in metaphysics, asks why anything exists at all, why there is something rather than nothing, and this question seems to demand an answer. Seems like there must be some explanation for the existence of the universe, some reason why being triumphs over non-being, and yet every proposed answer creates problems, creates paradoxes, leads to infinite regress or unjustified stopping points. And this is the ontological paradox, the puzzle about existence itself, about whether existence requires explanation, whether existence can be explained, whether there could be a sufficient reason for there being something rather than nothing. And the paradox arises because existence seems to be a brute fact, seems to be something that just is without explanation, and yet accepting brute facts seems unsatisfying, seems to violate the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation, and this tension between the demand for explanation and the impossibility of ultimate explanation creates the ontological paradox. A paradox that has troubled philosophers since ancient times, that remains unresolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, and that reveals deep limits on human understanding, on our capacity to explain why things are rather than why they are not. Imagine trying to explain why the universe exists, why there is something rather than nothing, and you might say the universe exists because it was created, but then you must explain why the creator exists. And if you say the creator exists necessarily, exists by its own nature, cannot fail to exist, then you face the question of why necessary existence is possible, why there are any necessary beings, why the category of necessary existence is not empty. And if you say the creator has no explanation, exists as a brute fact, then you have abandoned the demand for explanation, have accepted that existence requires no reason. And if existence requires no reason, then why not say the universe itself exists as a brute fact? Why invoke a creator at all? And the explanatory chain either goes on forever, infinite regress, or stops at something unexplained. Brute fact, and neither option is satisfying. Neither provides the ultimate explanation we were seeking. And the ontological paradox emerges, the recognition that existence cannot be fully explained, that the question why something rather than nothing has no satisfactory answer. The paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. Either everything has an explanation, or some things are brute facts without explanation. If everything has an explanation, then there must be an explanation for the totality of all facts, for why anything exists at all. And this explanation must appeal to something outside the totality, something that explains why the totality exists. But nothing is outside the totality. The totality includes everything. And so there can be no explanation for the totality. And so not everything has an explanation. And there are brute facts. And if there are brute facts, then the principle of sufficient reason is false. And we must accept that some things exist without reason, without explanation. And if existence requires no explanation, then the question why something rather than nothing has no answer is not a real question, is based on the false assumption that existence requires explanation. Visualize nothingness, absolute nothingness, no matter, no energy, no space, no time, no laws of nature, no mathematical structures, no abstract objects, nothing at all. And from this nothingness, something emerges. The universe comes into being. And the question is why? What caused this emergence? What explained this transition from nothing to something? And the problem is that causes and explanations presuppose existence, presuppose that there are things that can cause and explain. And absolute nothingness contains no causes, no explanations, nothing that could produce something. And so the emergence from nothing seems impossible, seems to violate principles of causation and explanation. And yet here we are. Existence is actual. Something exists. And this existence seems inexplicable, seems to be a brute fact that cannot be explained in terms of anything more fundamental, because there is nothing more fundamental than existence itself. One response to the ontological paradox accepts it, accepts that existence is a brute fact, that there is no explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, that the universe just exists without reason, and this response abandons the principle of sufficient reason, abandons the demand that everything be explained, and treats existence as the foundation, as the starting point beyond which explanation cannot go. And this response is common among atheist philosophers, among those who see the universe as all there is, as existing without creator or external explanation. And the ontological paradox is dissolved by rejecting one of its premises, by denying that existence requires explanation. Another response appeals to necessary existence, argues that something must exist, that nothingness is not a genuine possibility, that existence is necessary, and the question why something rather than nothing is based on the false assumption that nothing is a real alternative. And various arguments have been offered for necessary existence, arguments that nothingness is unstable, that something must arise from nothing due to quantum fluctuations or logical necessity, or arguments that necessary beings like God exist by their nature and cannot fail to exist. And these arguments attempt to show that existence is not contingent, not dependent on external factors, but is necessary, is unavoidable. And if existence is necessary, then the question why something rather than nothing dissolves. The answer is that something must exist. Nothing is not an option. A third response questions the question, argues that why is there something rather than nothing is not a genuine question, is based on confusion about what questions can meaningfully be asked. And the question presupposes that nothing is the default, the expected state, and something is the deviation that requires explanation. But this presupposition is unjustified. There is no reason to privilege nothing over something, no reason to think nothing is more natural or more likely. And if something and nothing are on equal footing, then the question collapses, becomes unanswerable because it has no presupposition to support it. And the ontological paradox dissolves because the founding question is revealed to be pseudo-question. The ontological paradox also connects to debates about cosmology, about the origin of the universe, about whether the Big Bang was the beginning of everything, or whether something existed before, and cosmologists have proposed various scenarios. Eternal inflation, where universes are constantly being created in a multiverse. Cyclic cosmologies, where the universe goes through endless cycles of expansion and contraction. Quantum creation, where the universe emerged from quantum vacuum fluctuations, and each scenario pushes the question back, explains our universe in terms of something more fundamental. But the question remains why that more fundamental thing exists, why there is quantum vacuum, why there are laws of physics, why there is anything at all. And the ontological paradox persists at every level, cannot be escaped by postulating more fundamental entities or processes. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, treat it as revealing something deep about the limits of explanation, about the structure of understanding. That explanation must stop somewhere, must reach a foundation that is itself unexplained. And existence is that foundation, is the basic fact that grounds all other facts. And accepting this involves accepting that not everything can be explained, that the demand for total explanation is impossible to satisfy, and the ontological paradox is not a problem to solve, but a limit to accept, a recognition that human understanding has boundaries, that some questions have no answers, and the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is such a question, is beyond our capacity to answer. And we must live with the mystery, with the brute fact of existence. The universe exists, spreads across billions of light years, contains galaxies and stars and planets and life. And the question echoes, why? Why does any of this exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And no answer fully satisfies, no explanation reaches the ultimate ground. And the ontological paradox persists, ancient and insoluble, a paradox that reveals the limits of metaphysics, the boundaries of explanation, the point where philosophy must fall silent and accept that existence simply is, without reason, without cause, without ultimate explanation, and the paradox endures as one of the deepest problems in philosophy, a problem that perhaps cannot be solved because it points to the edge of what can be understood, the limit where explanation gives out and brute fact takes over, and existence remains, mysterious and fundamental, and the question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The non-identity problem, why creating a disabled child, seems wrong but harms no one. A woman takes medication that she knows will cause her future child to be born with a disability that will significantly reduce the child's quality of life, but will not make life so bad that it is not worth living, and the child will live with chronic pain, with limited mobility, with challenges that most people do not face. But the child will still experience joy and love and meaning, and life will be worth living overall, just harder, just less good than it could have been. And we are inclined to say that the woman did something wrong, that she should have stopped taking the medication, should have waited until it cleared her system before conceiving. And if she had waited, she would have conceived a different child, a healthy child. And this seems like the obviously right choice, but now philosopher Derek Parfit poses a troubling question. Who exactly was harmed by the woman's choice? Who was made worse off? And the answer is puzzling because the disabled child cannot claim to have been harmed. Because if the woman had waited and conceived a different child, then this particular child would not exist at all, and the disabled child's only alternative to existing with a disability is not existing. And existing with a disability, as long as life is worth living, is better than not existing. And so the disabled child is not worse off, is actually better off for existing. And if no one was harmed, then how can the action be wrong? And this is the non-identity problem, a puzzle about how to ground judgments of wrongness in cases where the identity of affected individuals depends on the choices being evaluated. Imagine the scenario more carefully. At time 1, the woman is taking medication, and she has a choice: conceive now and have a disabled child, or wait a month, stop the medication, and conceive a healthy child. And suppose she chooses to conceive now, and 9 months later, a child is born with a disability. Call this child Alex, and Alex grows up facing challenges, but also experiencing good things. And on balance, Alex is glad to be alive, prefers existing to not existing. And now we ask whether the woman wronged Alex, whether Alex was harmed by the woman's choice. And the problem is that the alternative was not Alex without the disability. The alternative was a different child entirely, because different sperm and egg would have united if the woman had waited, and different genetic material produces a different person. And so Alex's options were either exist with the disability or not exist at all. And Alex is better off existing with the disability than not existing. And so how can Alex complain? How can Alex say the woman wronged them, when the only other possibility is non-existence? And if Alex cannot complain, then who can? And if no one can complain, then in what sense was the action wrong? The problem generalizes beyond this specific case. It arises whenever a choice affects who will exist rather than merely affecting how existing people will fare. And these cases are called non-identity cases, and they include decisions about environmental policy, where current generations choose between policies that affect which future people will exist. Decisions about genetic engineering, where parents choose traits for children who would not exist without that choice. Decisions about timing of reproduction, where different times lead to different children. And in all these cases, the people affected by the choice cannot claim they would have been better off if a different choice had been made, because they would not have existed if a different choice had been made. And so, standard harm-based reasoning seems to fail, seems unable to explain why these choices might be wrong. Visualize the problem as a branching tree. At the decision point, 2 branches extend. On one branch, a child with disability exists. On the other branch, a different healthy child exists, and we compare the two branches and say the second is better, produces a better outcome, a healthier child, less suffering, more well-being, but when we try to say who benefits from choosing the second branch, we cannot point to anyone. The disabled child does not benefit because that child does not exist in the second branch. The healthy child does not benefit because that child does not exist in the first branch. And so there is no person who is made better off by choosing the better branch. And this seems to undermine the claim that the better outcome is better for anyone. And yet we strongly feel that the choice matters, that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong. Parfit proposed the non-identity problem as a challenge to person-affecting principles. Principles that say an action is wrong only if it makes someone worse off. And these principles work well for ordinary cases where the same people exist regardless of the choice, but they fail for non-identity cases where different choices lead to different people existing. And if we want to maintain that choices in non-identity cases can be wrong, we must adopt impersonal principles, principles that evaluate outcomes based on total or average well-being, or some other measure that does not depend on comparing how well off particular individuals are across different choices. But impersonal principles face their own difficulties. They can imply things like the repugnant conclusion. They can recommend creating vast populations with minimal welfare, and they can conflict with intuitions about person-relative reasons and obligations. One response to the non-identity problem is to reject the claim that wrongness requires harming someone, to argue that some actions are wrong, even though they do not make anyone worse off, and creating a child with an avoidable disability is wrong. Not because it harms the child, but because it fails to give the child the best start in life, violates a duty to create the best children we can, and this response requires specifying what duties we have regarding procreation, what standards of care apply to potential children, and whether these duties are owed to specific individuals or are impersonal obligations about making the world better. Another response is to argue that the disabled child is harmed after all, harmed relative to an appropriate baseline, and the baseline is not non-existence, but rather the life the child could have had if different choices had been made, even though those choices would have resulted in a different child. We can still say that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong because it brings into existence someone whose life contains avoidable suffering. And this suffering is bad even if it does not make anyone worse off compared to any alternative where that same person exists. And this response requires defending an impersonal notion of harm. Harm that is not comparative, not based on counterfactuals about specific individuals, but based on the presence of bad states like suffering. A third response is to bite the bullet and accept that the action is not wrong, that if no one is harmed, then nothing bad has happened. And this response embraces person-affecting principles and accepts their implications even in non-identity cases, admits that we cannot say the woman wronged the disabled child, cannot say she should have waited, and while this seems counterintuitive, perhaps our intuitions are wrong, perhaps we are confused about non-identity cases, and the theoretical clarity of person-affecting principles outweighs the cost of accepting counterintuitive conclusions. The non-identity problem has practical implications for reproductive ethics, for decisions about genetic screening, prenatal testing, selective abortion, and genetic modification, because many of these decisions are non-identity cases where choosing one option means one child exists, and choosing another means a different child exists. And if we cannot say these choices harm anyone, then it becomes difficult to regulate them. Difficult to say parents have obligations about which children to create. And yet most people feel strongly that some procreative choices are wrong, that parents should not knowingly create children with serious avoidable disabilities, that we have reasons to prefer healthy children, and these feelings need grounding, need principles that explain why these choices matter, even though no particular person is made worse off. The woman stands at the choice point, medication in hand, and she can conceive now or wait, can create a child with disability or create a different healthy child, and the choice seems obvious. And yet when we try to justify the obvious answer, try to explain why waiting is better, the justification becomes elusive, slips through our fingers, because no one is harmed by conceiving now. The child who exists is glad to exist, and the child who would exist if she waited does not exist to be disappointed. And the non-identity problem reveals a gap in our moral thinking, a case where our judgments are clear, but our reasons are unclear, where standard moral frameworks fail to explain intuitions we hold strongly, and Parfit's problem remains unsolved, challenging, forcing recognition that identity matters, that who exists matters, and that moral philosophy has not yet developed adequate tools for handling cases where choices determine who exists rather than merely how well existing people fare. And the problem persists, technical and troubling, a reminder that even procreation, the most basic of human activities, raises profound ethical puzzles that resist easy answers. The manipulation argument, when being programmed feels like choosing. A scientist creates a person in a laboratory, designs their brain molecule by molecule, programs their psychology precisely, installs specific beliefs, desires, values, personality traits, and then releases this person into the world, and the person deliberates about what to do, weighs options, considers consequences, makes decisions based on their reasons, their desires, their values, and all of this psychological processing feels normal from the inside, feels like genuine deliberation, genuine choice, and yet the person's entire psychology was determined by the scientist, was programmed. And so the person's choices are not really their own, not really free, are the scientist's choices implemented through the person's brain, and the person is not responsible for actions that flow from programmed psychology, is more like a puppet than an agent. And this is the manipulation argument against compatibilism. The argument that being determined by natural causes, by genes and environment, is relevantly similar to being determined by manipulation, by programming. And if programmed persons lack free will, then naturally determined persons also lack free will. And since determinism says all persons are naturally determined, all persons lack free will if determinism is true, and compatibilism is false. And this manipulation argument, developed by Dirk Peerboom and others, creates a serious challenge for compatibilist theories, forces compatibilists to explain how natural determination differs from manipulation, how being caused by evolution and upbringing differs from being caused by a neuroscientist. And the argument remains controversial, remains debated, and compatibilists offer various responses. But the challenge persists. Imagine the manipulated person situation. They wake up in the laboratory, memories implanted, personality formed, and they go about their life, make choices, pursue goals, and from their perspective, everything seems normal. They feel like they are choosing freely, feel like their decisions are their own, and yet every thought, every desire, every value was installed by the scientist. And nothing about their psychology is random. Nothing escaped the scientist's control. And now consider whether this person is morally responsible for their actions, whether they deserve praise or blame. And the intuition is no. They are not responsible because their actions flow from programmed psychology, from values and desires they did not choose, that were imposed on them. And responsibility requires that psychology be one's own, not be externally determined. And the manipulated person's psychology is not their own, is the scientist's creation. And so they lack responsibility, lack free will. The manipulation argument proceeds through cases, starts with extreme manipulation, obvious programming, and then gradually moves toward more natural cases, and asks at each stage whether the person is responsible, and the cases are designed to show that there is no relevant difference between manipulation and natural causation, that if manipulation undermines responsibility, then natural determination also undermines responsibility. And the four-case argument, Pereboom's version, goes as follows. In case 1, a person is directly manipulated by scientists who induce specific mental states. In case 2, a person is programmed from birth by scientists who arrange their environment and training. In case 3, a person is determined by their genetic inheritance and upbringing without any intentional manipulation. In case 4, a person is determined by the normal causal processes of a deterministic universe. And Pereboom argues that there is no morally relevant difference between these cases, that if case 1 undermines responsibility, then so do the others. And since case 4 is just determinism, determinism undermines responsibility, and compatibilism is false. Visualize the progression, from direct neural manipulation to genetic engineering to natural upbringing to deterministic causation. And at each stage, the person's psychology is caused by factors beyond their control, factors they did not choose. And the manipulation argument says that the source of causation, whether intentional or natural, does not matter for responsibility. What matters is that the person's psychology was determined by factors beyond their control. And this determination undermines freedom regardless of whether a scientist or nature did the determining. And if we agree that the manipulated person, in case 1, is not responsible, then we must agree that naturally determined persons, in case 4, are also not responsible, and compatibilism, which says determinism is compatible with responsibility, is refuted. Compatibilists respond to the manipulation argument with various strategies. One response distinguishes between manipulation and natural determination, argues that manipulation involves bypassing the person's normal, deliberative processes, involves imposing psychology externally, while natural determination involves the person's psychology developing through normal processes, through learning and experience and interaction with the world. And this difference matters for responsibility, makes naturally determined persons responsible, even though manipulated persons are not. And the manipulation argument fails because it ignores this difference, treats all determination as equivalent when it is not. Another compatibilist response argues that the manipulated person is responsible, challenges the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility. And this response requires biting the bullet, accepting that even persons whose psychology was programmed by scientists are responsible as long as their actions flow from their own deliberation, their own reasons, even if those reasons were installed. And this response preserves compatibilism by denying that manipulation undermines responsibility, by insisting that what matters for responsibility is not the origin of psychology, but its current functional organization. And if the person deliberates and acts on their deliberations, then they are responsible, regardless of how their psychology came to be. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between historical and structural accounts of responsibility, argues that responsibility depends on the structure of the person's psychology, on whether they have the right kind of control mechanisms, the right kind of reflective capacities, not on the history of how that psychology was formed and manipulated. Persons can have the right structure, even if their history is abnormal, and so they are responsible. And the manipulation argument fails because it assumes that history matters when only structure matters, and compatibilism is preserved by adopting a structural rather than historical account of responsibility. Incompatibilists defend the manipulation argument, defend the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and argue that compatibilist responses are ad hoc, are motivated by a desire to save compatibilism rather than by principled distinctions, and there is no relevant difference between being determined by a scientist and being determined by genes and environment. Both involve the person's psychology being shaped by factors beyond their control. Both undermine the kind of control required for responsibility, and the manipulation argument succeeds in showing that compatibilism is false, that determination, whether by manipulation or by nature, is inconsistent with freedom. The manipulation argument also raises questions about what responsibility requires, about whether responsibility is historical, depends on how psychology was formed, or structural, depends only on current organisation, and this debate is central to understanding free will, to clarifying what kind of control is required for moral responsibility, and the manipulation argument forces this debate into the open, makes it explicit. And even if the argument does not definitively refute compatibilism, it succeeds in challenging compatibilists to articulate their view clearly, to explain what distinguishes responsible from non-responsible agents. The programmed person walks through life, choosing, deliberating, acting, and feeling free. And the question remains whether they are genuinely responsible, whether their choices are truly their own, or whether they are puppets, implementations of the scientist's design, and the manipulation argument uses this person to challenge compatibilism, to question whether natural determination is really different from artificial manipulation, and the argument persists as one of the most powerful challenges to compatibilist theories. A challenge that highlights the difference between feeling free and being free, between subjective experience of choice and objective reality of determination. And the manipulated person remains, choosing but programmed, free-feeling but determined. And whether such a person is responsible remains contested. And the manipulation argument endures as a permanent challenge to compatibilism, forcing recognition that if determinism is true, then we are all in a sense manipulated, determined by factors beyond our control, and whether this determination undermines responsibility, whether it makes us unfree, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will. The ladder paradox: how moving objects shrink and fit where they shouldn't. A ladder 10 meters long rushes toward a garage that is only 8 meters deep. The garage has a front door and a back door, both initially open, and the ladder is traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, fast enough that length contraction becomes important. And according to special relativity objects moving at high speed contract along their direction of motion, and an observer standing in the garage watching the ladder approach calculates that at 80% of light speed, the ladder contracts to 6 meters, shorter than the garage, and so the observer plans to trap the ladder inside by simultaneously closing both doors for a brief moment, catching the entire contracted ladder inside the 8-meter garage. And this seems straightforward. The moving ladder fits because it is contracted, but now consider the perspective of someone riding on the ladder. In their reference frame, the ladder is at rest and maintains its full 10-meter length, while the garage is moving toward them at 80% of light speed, and so the garage contracts to less than 5 meters deep, far too small to contain the 10-meter ladder, and the person on the ladder knows that the front of the ladder will exit the back door before the back of the ladder enters the front door, and trapping the ladder inside is impossible, and so the two observers disagree about whether the ladder fits inside the garage, whether both doors can be closed simultaneously with the ladder inside. And this is the ladder paradox, also called the barn pole paradox, a puzzle about how length contraction and simultaneity interact in special relativity. The resolution lies in understanding that simultaneity is relative, that events which are simultaneous in one reference frame are not simultaneous in another, and the garage observer sees both doors closing at the same time, trapping the ladder, but the ladder observer sees the doors closing at different times. The front door closes first, then the back door closes later, and in the ladder frame, the sequence of events is as follows. The front of the ladder, still 10 meters away from the back of the ladder, enters the contracted garage and immediately exits the back door, and only after the entire ladder has passed through the garage does the back door close, followed by the front door closing, and so in the ladder frame, the ladder never fits entirely inside the garage. It is always longer than the garage, but the doors are never closed simultaneously with the ladder inside, and this removes the contradiction. Both observers agree on the physical facts. They agree on when collisions occur, on whether the ladder gets scratched or damaged, but they disagree about which events are simultaneous, about the order in which certain events happen. And this disagreement is not a matter of illusion or observation delay, but a fundamental feature of space-time in special relativity. Imagine space-time diagrams for both perspectives. In the garage frame, the diagram shows the two doors as vertical lines fixed in position, and the ladder as a diagonal streak moving horizontally through space and vertically through time. And the ladder is shortened by length contraction. And there is a moment when the back of the ladder has entered the front door and the front of the ladder has not yet exited the back door. And at this moment, both doors can be closed simultaneously, trapping the contracted ladder. And in the ladder frame, the diagram shows the ladder as two vertical lines, the front and back of the ladder stationary, and the garage as a moving object, contracted along the direction of motion. And the two doors close at different times. First, the front door closes and then opens, allowing the front of the ladder to pass. And then the back door closes after the back of the ladder has already entered. And the doors are never simultaneously closed around the ladder, and both descriptions are correct. Both are consistent with the laws of physics, and the apparent contradiction arises only from expecting that simultaneous in one frame means simultaneous in all frames. And relativity denies this. Simultaneity is frame dependent. The paradox also highlights the role of signals and information, because if the closing of the doors is controlled by signals sent at the speed of light, then the relativity of simultaneity ensures that the signals arrive at different times in different frames, and the physical mechanism that closes the doors respects causality and relativity, and no contradiction arises. The doors can be set to close when the ladder is inside, as measured in the garage frame, and this same mechanism, viewed from the ladder frame, closes the doors at different times, and the ladder is never trapped because it never fits entirely inside. And both descriptions are correct and consistent. Some people find this resolution unsatisfying. It seems like the ladder either fits or does not fit. There should be an objective fact of the matter, but relativity says that fits inside is not an objective notion. When motion is involved, it depends on what simultaneity convention is used, on which reference frame is chosen, and different frames can disagree about spatial relationships without any frame being wrong. And this is one of the deepest lessons of relativity, that spatial and temporal relationships are frame-dependent, that there is no absolute space or absolute time, and that what counts as simultaneous or as fitting inside depends on the observer's state of motion. The ladder paradox has practical analogues in particle physics, where particles travelling at relativistic speeds appear contracted in the laboratory frame. And this contraction affects how they interact with detectors, how they traverse magnetic fields, and how their collisions are modelled. And physicists routinely account for length contraction and time dilation in analysing experiments. And the paradoxical features of relativity are not mere thought experiments, but daily realities in accelerator laboratories. Visualise the ladder streaking toward the garage, its atoms compressed along the direction of motion. The electromagnetic forces between atoms adjusted by the motion, creating a physically shorter object in the garage frame, and the garage rushing toward the ladder in the ladder frame, compressed to a narrow slit, and the ladder threading through this slit without ever being contained. And both pictures are correct, both are consistent, and the paradox dissolves once simultaneity is properly understood, once it is accepted that different observers experience different orderings of spatially separated events, and the ladder paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how length contraction and relativity of simultaneity work together, how apparent contradictions in relativity are resolved by careful analysis of reference frames, and how our intuitions about space and time, trained on low-speed everyday experience, fail completely when speeds approach that of light, and the ladder passes through. Contracted or not, trapped or not, depending on who you ask, depending on what frame you occupy, and the paradox endures as a reminder that space and time are not what they seem. That motion affects not just how we measure things, but what length and simultaneity mean, and that Einstein's revolution was not just about equations, but about reconceiving the very fabric of reality. The lottery paradox. Imagine a fair lottery with 1 million tickets, and exactly one ticket will win, and you have not yet learned which ticket won. And now consider each individual ticket. Ticket number 1 has a 1 in a million chance of winning, which means it has a 999,999 in a million chance of losing. And this is overwhelmingly probable, so probable that it seems rational to believe that ticket 1 will not win. And the same reasoning applies to ticket 2, ticket 3, and every other ticket. Each has a minuscule chance of winning and an enormous chance of losing, and so it seems rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win. But now a problem emerges. If you believe that ticket 1 will not win, and you believe that ticket 2 will not win, and you believe this for each of the million tickets, then it seems you should believe that no ticket will win, because belief is generally thought to be closed under conjunction. If you believe P and you believe Q, then you should believe P and Q. And by repeated application of this principle, if you believe of each ticket that it will not win, then you should believe that none of them will win. But you also know with certainty that exactly one ticket will win. This is a stipulated fact of the lottery, and so you believe both that no ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these beliefs are contradictory, and so you hold contradictory beliefs, which seems paradigmatically irrational. Yet each individual belief, the belief that ticket 1 will not win, the belief that ticket 2 will not win, and so on, seems perfectly rational, justified by the overwhelming probability. And so the lottery paradox forces a choice between accepting that rational belief can be inconsistent, rejecting closure of belief under conjunction, or denying that high probability is sufficient for rational belief. The paradox was articulated by Henry Kaiberg in the 1960s, and it has generated an enormous literature in epistemology with various proposed solutions and no clear consensus. And the paradox reveals deep tensions in our ordinary thinking about belief, knowledge, probability, and rationality. Tensions that cannot be easily resolved without giving up some cherished principles or intuitions. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that you can rationally believe each of many propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the propositions are probabilistic and the number of them is large. And this response aligns with the observation that the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts. And so even if each ticket has only a 1 in a million chance of winning, the probability that at least one ticket wins is certainty. And so there is a gap between the high probability of each individual proposition and the low probability of their conjunction. And this gap justifies believing each individual proposition while not believing their conjunction. Another response is to raise the threshold for rational belief, to argue that high probability is not sufficient for belief, that belief requires something stronger, perhaps near certainty or probability, above some higher threshold, like 99% or 99.9%. And if we raise the threshold high enough, then it will no longer be rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win, because the probability that it will not win, while high, is not high enough to meet the raised threshold. And so the paradox dissolves, because the initial premise that it is rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win is rejected. A third response distinguishes between degrees of belief or credence and full belief, arguing that we should assign high credence to the proposition that ticket 1 will not win, perhaps 99.9999%, but we should not fully believe it. And full belief is reserved for propositions that meet a higher standard, perhaps certainty or near certainty. And this response preserves the intuition that high probability matters for rationality, while avoiding the paradox by denying that high probability justifies full belief. Still another response embraces a kind of rational inconsistency, arguing that in certain situations it is rational to hold inconsistent beliefs, that consistency is not an absolute requirement of rationality, that the world is complex and uncertain, and our beliefs must reflect that uncertainty, even if it means tolerating some inconsistency. And this response aligns with the preface paradox, where an author rationally believes each claim in a book while rationally believing that not. All the claims are true, and both paradoxes suggest that closure of belief under conjunction is too strong a requirement, that it demands a kind of logical perfection that finite agents in uncertain environments cannot achieve. The lottery paradox also connects to debates about the nature of knowledge, because it seems clear that you do not know that ticket 1 will not win, even though you have excellent evidence for believing it. And this suggests that knowledge requires something more than justified true belief, perhaps a safety condition, the requirement that in nearby possible worlds where you believe PP is true, and in the lottery case there are nearby worlds where the lottery is run fairly and ticket 1 wins, in which your belief that ticket 1 will not win is false, and so your belief fails the safety condition and does not constitute knowledge, even if it happens to be true. The paradox has practical implications as well, because we constantly make decisions based on beliefs that have high but not maximal probability. We believe that the plane will not crash, that the medicine will work, that the bridge will not collapse, and in each case there is a small probability that our belief is false. Yet we act on these beliefs. We board the plane, take the medicine, cross the bridge, and if we refuse to believe or act on anything less than certainty, we would be paralyzed, unable to function in a world of uncertainty. And so, the lottery paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a reflection of the epistemic situation we constantly face, the need to navigate between skepticism and credulity, between demanding too much certainty and accepting too little, between the logical ideal of perfect consistency and the practical necessity of acting on incomplete information. The million tickets sit in the urn, one will win, the others will lose, and reason seems to say both that we should believe of each, that it will lose, and that we should not believe that all will lose. And this contradiction, or apparent contradiction, has no easy resolution, no solution that preserves all intuitions and principles. And so the paradox remains a permanent challenge to theories of rational belief, a puzzle that forces philosophers to clarify what they mean by belief, by rationality, by justification, and to acknowledge that our ordinary concepts, when pressed to their limits, reveal inconsistencies and tensions that may be ineliminable features of finite cognition rather than problems to be solved. And the lottery continues, the tickets are drawn, one wins, the others lose, and we believe what we must believe, what rationality seems to demand, even when those beliefs, taken together, lead to contradiction. And the paradox endures, a monument to the gap between logical perfection and epistemic reality, between what we ought to believe in principle and what we must believe in practice. The Noah paradox. There exists a peculiar sentence that seems to lead directly to contradiction, and this sentence states the knower is not known. And the question arises, is this sentence true or false? And both options lead to trouble, creating what is known as the Noah paradox, a puzzle in epistemic logic that reveals tensions between knowledge, truth, and self-reference. Suppose the sentence the knower is not known is true. Then by definition of what the sentence says, the fact that the knower is not known is itself not known. It is a truth that escapes knowledge, but if this is a truth, then it is knowable. There is nothing incoherent about knowing that something is not known. We know many facts of the form. Nobody knows X. We know that nobody knows the exact number of grains of sand on all the Earth's beaches, and so if the knower is not known is true, then someone could know it. But if someone knows it, then they know that the knower is not known, which means the knower, the fact that the knower is not known, is now known. And this contradicts the content of the sentence, which states that this fact is not known. And so assuming the sentence is true leads to contradiction. Suppose instead that the sentence is false, then its negation is true, which means the knower is known, which means someone knows that the knower is not known. But if someone knows this, then the knower, the proposition that the knower is not known, is indeed not known becomes known. And so the sentence is true after all. And again, contradiction emerges. And so neither assuming the sentence is true, nor assuming it is false, leads to a consistent outcome, and the paradox resists resolution through ordinary logical means. The knower paradox is related to the liar paradox and other self-referential semantic paradoxes, but it involves knowledge rather than truth, and it shows that knowledge, like truth, cannot be fully captured within a single, consistent formal system without restrictions, that self-reference combined with epistemic notions generates instability, and the paradox has implications for epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because standard epistemic logics treat knowledge as a modality, a sentential operator that applies to propositions. And these logics typically assume that knowledge is factive. If you know P, then P is true. And that knowledge is transparent. If you know P, then you know that you know P. And these principles, which seem innocuous, interact with self-reference to produce paradoxes like the knower. One response to the knower paradox is to restrict self-reference, to prohibit sentences that refer to their own knowability status, much like Tarski's hierarchy of languages prohibits sentences that refer to their own truth. And on this approach, the knower is not known is not a genuine sentence, not a proposition with a truth value, but a piece of ill-formed language that violates the rules of proper semantic construction. And while this response avoids contradiction, it does so at the cost of limiting what can be said, of ruling out sentences that seem grammatically and conceptually well-formed. And it leaves open the question of why these restrictions should be imposed, whether they reflect genuine features of knowledge or are merely technical devices to preserve consistency. Another response distinguishes between levels of knowledge, perhaps first-order knowledge about the world, second-order knowledge about knowledge, third-order knowledge about knowledge of knowledge, and so on, and argues that the knower paradox conflates these levels, that the knower is not known involves a sentence referring to its own knowability at the same level, and that this is illegitimate, that knowledge statements must be stratified into a hierarchy where knowledge at one level can only apply to propositions at lower levels, and this hierarchical approach mirrors solutions to the liar paradox and other semantic paradoxes, but it raises questions about whether ordinary knowledge attributions respect such hierarchies, whether in natural language we freely mix levels of knowledge without contradiction, and whether imposing hierarchies is a genuine solution or merely a way of avoiding the problem. Some philosophers embrace paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions to exist without trivializing the entire system, without forcing the conclusion that everything is true. And in paraconsistent frameworks, the knower paradox can be true and false simultaneously. The sentence can be both known and not known, and the contradiction is tolerated rather than resolved, contained within the logical system without spreading. And while this approach is radical, it has the advantage of taking the paradox at face value, of not dismissing it as ill-formed or illegitimate, but recognizing it as revealing something genuine about the limits of consistent reasoning about knowledge. The knower paradox also connects to issues about the closure of knowledge under known entailment. The principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you know Q, because this principle, combined with the factivity of knowledge and certain assumptions about self-knowledge, can be used to derive paradoxes, and some epistemologists have questioned whether closure should be unrestricted, whether there are cases where you know P and know that P entails Q but do not know Q, perhaps because Q is a complicated consequence that you have not worked out, or because Q involves self-referential or paradoxical content that resists knowledge. The paradox raises questions about the transparency of knowledge, The principle that if you know P, then you know that you know P, because this principle, known as the KK principle, is controversial. Some argue that it is too strong, that there are cases where you know something without knowing that you know it. Perhaps because you're not introspectively aware of your knowledge, or because the recognition of knowledge requires second-order reflection that you have not performed. And if the KK principle is rejected, then some versions of the Noah paradox may be blocked because the reasoning depends on assumptions about what is knowable given what is known. The Noah paradox sits alongside other epistemic paradoxes, the surprise examination paradox, Fitch's paradox, Moore's paradox, each revealing different tensions in our concepts of knowledge and belief, each challenging the assumption that these concepts can be fully formalized without residue, and together they suggest that knowledge is a more complex and less tractable notion than it appears, that self-reference and knowledge do not mix well, that there are limits to what can be known or consistently said about knowledge, and that the project of epistemic logic, while valuable, must navigate carefully around paradoxes that threaten its foundations. The sentence "the knower is not known" hangs in conceptual space, neither comfortably true nor comfortably false, a knot that logic cannot untie, a puzzle that resists the tools we use to solve puzzles, and it reminds us that language and thought contain traps, that self-reference is dangerous, that some sentences generate contradictions not because they are meaningless, but because they expose the limits of our logical systems, the boundaries where consistency breaks down and paradox takes over, and the Noah paradox remains, a thorn in the side of epistemic logic, a challenge to anyone who claims to understand what knowledge is and how it operates. And the question persists, is the knower known or unknown? And the answer, whatever it is, leads to contradiction. And the paradox endures, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical puzzles, a reminder that even knowledge itself, the concept at the heart of epistemology, contains mysteries that philosophy has not yet fathomed. The is-ought problem, why facts cannot tell us what to do. Science describes the world, tells us what is, what exists, how things work, the laws of nature, the facts about atoms and organisms and stars, and these descriptions are supported by evidence, by observation and experiment, and they are objective, true or false, regardless of what anyone thinks or wants. And ethics prescribes action, tells us what ought to be, what we should do, what goals to pursue, how to treat others, and these prescriptions are normative, involve value and obligation. And the question that has haunted philosophy since David Hume raised it in 1739 is whether we can derive ought from is, whether we can move from factual premises to moral conclusions, whether what exists tells us anything about what should exist. And Hume's answer was no. There is a gap, an unbridgeable chasm between descriptions and prescriptions, between facts and values, between is and ought, and no amount of purely factual information can tell us what we should do. And this is the is-ought problem, sometimes called Hume's guillotine, because it cuts moral reasoning off from empirical inquiry, separates facts from values, and leaves us wondering how moral knowledge is possible if it cannot be derived from facts about the world. Hume observed that writers on morality begin with ordinary observations, with statements about human nature or God or social arrangements, statements that use the copula is, describing what exists, and then suddenly they switch to statements using ought or ought not, prescribing actions or condemning behaviours. And this transition, Hume says, is never explained, is never justified. The writers seem to assume that the ought follows from the is, that because things are a certain way we should act in a certain way, but this assumption is invalid, the ought does not follow. There is a logical gap, and any argument that moves from is to ought is either invalid or contains a hidden normative premise that was smuggled in. And if all moral arguments ultimately rest on normative premises that cannot be derived from facts, then moral reasoning is fundamentally different from empirical reasoning, is based on values or sentiments or intuitions that are not themselves factual claims. Visualize an argument that tries to derive ought from is. Suppose someone says humans are naturally cooperative. This is a factual claim about human psychology, and then concludes, therefore, we ought to cooperate, a normative claim about how we should behave. And Hume's challenge is to explain how the conclusion follows from the premise, what licenses the move from description to prescription, and the argument seems to assume that what is natural is good, that we should act in accordance with our nature. But this assumption is itself a normative claim, a hidden ought premise, and if we make it explicit, the argument becomes humans are naturally cooperative, and we ought to act according to our nature. Therefore we ought to cooperate. And now the argument is valid, but it rests on a normative premise, the claim that we ought to act according to our nature. And this premise cannot be derived from facts about what human nature is. It is a value judgment, an ought claim, and so the original argument either was invalid or contained a hidden normative premise. And either way, the is-ought gap remains. The ought was not derived purely from is. The same problem arises for any attempt to ground morality in facts. If someone says actions that maximize happiness are good because happiness is what everyone wants, the argument moves from the facts that people desire happiness to the normative claim that happiness is good, and this move assumes that what people desire is good. Another hidden normative premise, or if someone says we should obey God's commands because God created us, the argument moves from the fact of creation to the obligation to obey, and this assumes that we ought to obey our Creator. Another normative premise, and in every case the derivation fails unless a normative premise is included, and if normative premises cannot themselves be derived from facts, then the ultimate foundation of ethics is non-factual, is based on values or intuitions or conventions that are not grounded in empirical reality. The is-ought problem creates a dilemma for moral philosophy. Either accept that moral claims are not factual, are not true or false in the way scientific claims are, but express attitudes or prescribe actions or reflect cultural conventions, and this leads to non-cognitivism or relativism, views that deny objective moral truth, or accept that moral claims are factual, but insist that moral facts are sui generis, are not reducible to natural facts, are known through intuition or reason rather than through empirical observation, and this leads to non-naturalism, the view that morality is objective but not part of the natural world, studied by science, or find some way to bridge the is-ought gap, to derive ought from is, and this requires showing that certain facts entail normative conclusions, that the gap is not as wide as Hume thought, and various philosophers have attempted this, have proposed that the gap can be crossed under certain conditions. One attempt to bridge the gap involves institutional facts, facts about social practices and their constitutive rules. John Searle argued that if you accept a role within an institution, you accept the obligations that come with it. If you are a chess player, you ought to move the bishop diagonally, not because of an additional normative premise, but because that is what it means to be playing chess. The ought is built into the description of the institution, and similarly, if you make a promise, you create an obligation, you ought to keep the promise, and this ought follows from the fact of promising, from the institution of promising and its rules, and Searle claims this shows that ought can be derived from is, that institutional facts bridge the gap. But critics respond that this only works if you already accept the institution, already grant that you ought to follow its rules, and so the normative premise is still there, hidden in the acceptance of the institution. Another attempt involves functional facts. Facts about what things are for. Philippa Foot and others argue that living things have natural functions. Hearts are for pumping blood, eyes are for seeing, and organisms can be evaluated by how well they fulfill their functions. A good heart pumps blood efficiently, a defective heart does not, and humans have functions too, and virtues are traits that enable humans to flourish. to live well, and so we ought to develop virtues, and this ought to follows from facts about human nature and human flourishing. But critics respond that this assumes flourishing is good, assumes that we ought to pursue the goals set by our nature, and these assumptions are normative, are not themselves derived from facts about what human nature is, and so the gap remains. Visualize the gap as a chasm. On one side stand all the facts, all the truths about how the world is, what exists, how things behave, and on the other side stand all the norms, all the truths about what ought to be, what we should do, what goals are worth pursuing. And Hume's claim is that no bridge connects the two sides, that you cannot start with facts alone and reach the norms, that any path from one side to the other requires a leap, requires introducing a normative premise that is not itself factual, and this chasm separates science from ethics, separates empirical inquiry from moral philosophy, and raises the question of how we can have moral knowledge if morality is not grounded in facts. The is-ought problem has implications for moral realism, for the claim that moral truths exist objectively, because if moral truths cannot be derived from natural facts, then what are they? How do we know them? And moral realists divide into naturalists who deny the gap and claim that moral facts are natural facts, and non-naturalists who accept the gap and claim that moral facts are sui generis, are known through intuition or reason, and both positions face challenges. Naturalists must explain how to bridge the gap, must show how ought follows from is, and non-naturalists must explain how we perceive non-natural moral facts, how these facts relate to natural facts, and whether morality can play any causal or explanatory role if it is separate from nature. The problem also affects applied ethics, because if we cannot derive ought from is then scientific information, alone cannot tell us what to do, cannot settle moral questions. A doctor knowing all the medical facts about a patient still needs normative principles to decide whether to continue treatment or allow death. An economist knowing all the facts about wealth distribution still needs values to decide whether inequality is unjust. And science can inform these decisions, can tell us the consequences of different actions, but it cannot by itself tell us what we ought to do, what outcomes we ought to pursue. And this means ethics is ineliminable, is not reducible to any empirical science, requires normative reflection and judgment that goes beyond factual knowledge. The chasm yawns, facts on one side, values on the other, and no bridge appears and Hume's guillotine falls. Severing is from ought, description from prescription, and the is-ought problem remains, unsolved, persistent, dividing metaethics into camps, challenging moral realism, questioning whether science can answer moral questions, and forcing recognition that normativity is distinct, that ought is not reducible to is, that values are not facts, or if they are facts, they are strange facts, facts that cannot be derived from ordinary empirical observations, and the problem endures as one of the central puzzles in philosophy, a reminder that ethics is autonomous, that moral reasoning requires more than empirical knowledge, and that the relationship between what is and what ought to be remains one of the deepest and most difficult questions we face. The liar paradox. There exists a statement so simple that it collapses the foundations of truth itself, a sentence that devours its own meaning the moment it is spoken. And this is the liar paradox, a loop that has haunted logicians and philosophers for over 2,000 years. The paradox is most famously expressed in a single declaration: this statement is false, and the mind recoils at what follows. For if the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. But if it is false, then it must be true because it correctly identifies itself as false. And so the cycle begins again, spiraling endlessly, without resolution, without escape. The ancient Greeks were the first to wrestle with this demon of language, and Epimenides, the Cretan, is often credited with an early version when he declared that all Cretans are liars, which implies that if he himself is a Cretan, then his statement must be a lie, which means Cretans might actually tell the truth, which means his statement might be true, which means it is false again. and the contradiction churns without mercy. Philosophers have spent centuries trying to solve or dissolve the paradox, and some argue that self-referential statements like this are simply meaningless, that language breaks down when it tries to refer to itself in this way, while others suggest that truth is not binary but exists on a spectrum, allowing for statements that are neither fully true nor fully false, hovering in some undefined space between. Bertrand Russell encountered similar contradictions when developing set theory and discovered that self-reference could destroy the entire logical framework of mathematics, leading him to create new systems that carefully excluded paradoxes like the liar from ever forming. The paradox also influenced Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems proved that within any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven, which itself echoes the spirit of the liar paradox, the idea that truth and provability are not always the same thing. Some modern logicians have proposed paraconsistent logics, systems where contradictions can exist without causing the entire structure to collapse, allowing the liar paradox to be true and false simultaneously without forcing us to accept that everything is true, which would render logic useless. Others reject the paradox entirely, claiming that natural language is too vague and imprecise to support rigorous logical analysis, that the liar paradox is a quirk of grammar rather than a deep philosophical problem. Yet the paradox persists, refusing to die, surfacing in new forms across disciplines, from computer science to legal theory, anywhere that self-reference appears. Consider a sign that reads, "Ignore this sign," or a rule that states there are no rules, or a person who says everything I say is a lie, and the same strange loop emerges, the same dizzying collapse of meaning. The liar paradox forces confrontation with the limits of language, logic, and truth itself, suggesting that reality may not always fit neatly into categories of true and false, that some truths may be inherently unstable, slipping through the fingers the moment they are grasped. It reminds us that words are not perfect mirrors of reality, but tools shaped by human thought. And sometimes those tools turn on themselves, revealing cracks in the structures we build to make sense of existence. The Monty Hall problem. A game show host presents 3 doors. Behind one is a valuable prize, a car perhaps, and behind the other 2 are less desirable outcomes, goats or some other consolation, and the contestant chooses a door, say, door number 1, but before the chosen door is opened, the host, who knows what is behind each door, opens one of the other doors, revealing a goat, and now 2 doors remain closed. The one the contestant originally chose, and one other, and the host offers a choice, stick with the original selection or switch to the other unopened door, and the question that has baffled and frustrated countless people is simple. Does it matter? Is there an advantage to switching? And the answer, counterintuitive as it seems, is yes. Switching doubles the probability of winning, changing the odds from 1 in 3 to 2 in 3. And this result violates most people's intuitions. Seems wrong? Feels like it cannot be right? Yet it is mathematically certain. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of the American television game show Let's Make a Deal, a puzzle, improbability that reveals how poorly human intuition handles conditional probability and how easily we can be misled by seemingly simple scenarios. The reasoning behind the correct answer goes as follows. When the contestant first chooses a door, the probability that the prize is behind that door is 1 in 3, and the probability that it is behind one of the other 2 doors is 2 in 3. And this much is uncontroversial. But when the host opens one of the other doors and reveals a goat, showing that the prize is not behind that door, the probabilities do not redistribute evenly among the remaining doors. The original choice still has a 1 in 3 probability of being correct because the host's action did not change the fact that the contestant's initial choice was made with 1 in 3 odds, but the other unopened door now has a 2 in 3 probability because the 2 in 3 chance that was distributed across the 2 unchosen doors is now concentrated in the single remaining door, and so switching to that door doubles the chance of winning. The intuition that misleads most people is the idea that once one door is opened and eliminated, there are 2 doors left, and the prize is equally likely to be behind either, giving a 50-50 chance regardless of whether you switch. But this reasoning ignores the information provided by the host's action, the fact that the host deliberately chose to open a door with a goat. And this deliberate choice is not random, it is constrained by knowledge. The host cannot open the door with the prize and will not open the door the contestant chose. And so the host's action provides information that updates the probabilities in a non-obvious way. A useful way to see why switching is advantageous is to imagine a version of the game with 1,000,000 doors. The contestant chooses one door, which has a 1 in a million chance of having the prize, and then the host opens 999,998 of the other doors, all showing goats, leaving only the contestant's original choice and one other door. And now it seems clear that the contestant's original choice, made with 1 in a million odds, is almost certainly wrong. And the remaining door, the one the host carefully avoided opening, is almost certainly the one with the prize, and switching gives a 999,999 in a million chance of winning. And the same principle applies with 3 doors, just with less dramatic numbers. The Monty Hall problem has been a source of controversy and heated debate, even among mathematicians and statisticians. And when Marilyn Vos Savant, a columnist known for her high IQ, published the correct answer in her magazine column in 1990, she received thousands of letters, many from PhD holders and professionals, insisting she was wrong. And the controversy revealed how deeply counterintuitive the solution is, how resistant people are to accepting it even when presented with mathematical proof. And this resistance reflects broader features of human cognition, the tendency to rely on heuristics and intuitions that work well in most everyday situations, but fail in probabilistic scenarios involving conditional information. The problem also illustrates the importance of conditioning in probability, the fact that probabilities must be updated in light of new information, and that the way information is acquired matters. The host's knowledge and deliberate choice of which door to open is crucial to the solution. If the host opened a door randomly and happened to reveal a goat, then the probabilities would indeed be 50-50. But because the host knows and deliberately avoids the prize door, the situation is different. And this distinction between random and informed selection is subtle and easy to miss. The Monty Hall problem has applications beyond game shows. It appears in medical testing, in legal reasoning, in machine learning, anywhere that probabilities must be updated based on partial information. And understanding the logic of the Monty Hall problem helps clarify how to reason correctly in these more consequential contexts, how to avoid fallacies, how to properly incorporate evidence into probability assessments. The problem also raises questions about the psychology of probability, about why people find certain probabilistic reasoning so difficult. And experiments have shown that even after being told the correct answer and shown simulations that demonstrate it, many people remain skeptical, unable to shake the intuition that switching makes no difference. And this persistence of false intuition, despite evidence, suggests that probabilistic thinking is not natural to humans, that we evolved in environments where simple heuristics like equiprobability were sufficient, and that the kind of careful conditional reasoning required by the Monty Hall problem is a learned skill that requires training and practice. The doors stand closed, one hides the prize, the host knows which. The contestant chooses. The host opens a door, reveals a goat, and offers the choice. And the decision, which seems inconsequential, which feels like a coin flip, is actually a test of probabilistic reasoning, a puzzle that most people get wrong, that defies intuition, that reveals the gap between how we think probability works and how it actually works. And the Monty Hall problem endures, a staple of probability courses, a cautionary tale about trusting intuition, a reminder that the world is full of situations where the obvious answer is wrong, where careful analysis reveals unexpected structure, where what seems like chance is actually determined by hidden information, and the contestant who switches, who overcomes intuition and follows the mathematics, walks away with the prize twice as often, and the contestant who sticks with the original choice, trusting gut instinct, wins only a third of the time. And the difference, the doubling of odds, is not a trick or a gimmick, but a genuine feature of how conditional probability operates, and the problem persists, puzzling new generations, frustrating those who encounter it, illuminating those who understand it. A small puzzle with large implications. A game show scenario that contains lessons about reasoning, evidence, and the limits of human intuition. The omniscience paradox. Can God know what it's like to not know everything? A theologian declares that God is omniscient, all-knowing, possessing complete and perfect knowledge of everything that can be known, every fact, every truth, every possibility, past, present, and future. And this claim seems straightforward, seems like a natural attribute of a perfect being, and yet a puzzle emerges when we consider what omniscience includes, whether it encompasses not just propositional knowledge, facts that can be stated as true or false, but also experiential knowledge, the knowledge of what something feels like, what it is like to undergo certain experiences. And the paradox asks whether God knows what it is like to not know something, whether God understands the experience of ignorance, confusion, discovery, learning, and if God does know what ignorance feels like, then God must have experienced ignorance. But if God has experienced ignorance, then God was not always omniscient, and if God cannot know what ignorance feels like, then there is something God does not know. And either way, omniscience seems incomplete, seems to have gaps, and this is the omniscience paradox, a puzzle about whether complete knowledge includes knowledge of incomplete knowledge, whether knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know. Imagine God trying to understand human experience, trying to grasp what it feels like to be confused, to search for answers, to wonder whether something is true, to make mistakes, to learn, to have that moment of insight when understanding suddenly clicks into place after struggling. And these experiences seem to require not knowing, seem to be essentially experiences of ignorance or partial knowledge. And if God has never been ignorant, has always known everything, then God has never had these experiences, has never felt what it is like to learn. And so there is an aspect of human experience that God cannot fully understand, cannot know from the inside, and this suggests that omniscience defined as knowing everything is actually impossible, because knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know everything, and these two forms of knowledge are incompatible, cannot both be had by the same being at the same time. The paradox connects to philosophical debates about the nature of knowledge, about whether there are different kinds of knowledge that cannot be reduced to each other, propositional knowledge, knowing that something is true, and experiential knowledge, knowing what something is like. And the distinction is illustrated by cases like colour perception. A person who has never seen red, but knows all the physical facts about red light, about wavelengths and retinal responses and neural processing, does not know what red looks like, does not have experiential knowledge of redness. And when they see red for the first time, they learn something new. And this suggests that experiential knowledge is distinct from propositional knowledge, cannot be obtained just by knowing facts. And if this is right, then God's omniscience, if it is purely propositional, misses something, misses the experiential dimension. And God does not know what it is like to see red for the first time, does not know what it is like to learn, does not know what ignorance feels like. Visualize the problem as a conflict between two divine attributes: omniscience, which requires always having known everything, and perfect empathy or understanding, which requires knowing what human experiences feel like from the inside. And human experiences include experiences of not knowing. And so perfect understanding seems to require having been ignorant, but omniscience seems to exclude ever being ignorant. And the two attributes pull in opposite directions, and something must give. Either God is not omniscient in the full experiential sense, or God does not fully understand human experience, or the distinction between propositional and experiential knowledge is mistaken, and God can know what ignorance feels like without ever being ignorant, through some superior form of knowledge that encompasses both facts and feelings. One theological response is to argue that God's knowledge is sui generis, is of a different kind than human knowledge, and God knows what ignorance is like, not by experiencing it, but by knowing its nature completely, by understanding all its causes and effects and phenomenal properties, and this understanding is so complete that it counts as knowing what ignorance is like, even though God has never been ignorant. And this response tries to bridge the gap between propositional and experiential knowledge, tries to say that sufficiently complete propositional knowledge includes experiential knowledge, but critics argue that this misses the point, that no amount of knowing facts about an experience captures what the experience is like, that there is an irreducible, subjective aspect that can only be known by having the experience, and so God's propositional knowledge, however complete, does not include experiential knowledge of ignorance. Another response is to embrace kenosis, the theological idea that God voluntarily limits divine attributes. And this view says that God can and does experience ignorance, that in becoming incarnate, in taking human form as Christ, God experienced human limitations, including not knowing things. And the gospel accounts support this, showing Jesus learning, growing in wisdom, not knowing when the end times would come. And this shows that God can experience ignorance without ceasing to be God, that omniscience is not essential to divinity, but is a power that can be set aside. And this resolves the paradox by denying that God is always omniscient, accepting that there are times when God voluntarily limits divine knowledge. But this creates new puzzles about whether a being that is not always omniscient can be called omniscient, and whether divine attributes can be temporary. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of ignorance, between merely not knowing a fact which God never experiences, and the phenomenology of searching for knowledge, the feeling of curiosity and discovery, which God might be able to simulate or understand through analogical reasoning, and God knows what it would be like to be in a state of ignorance, even though God is never actually in such a state. Just as someone who has never been to Mars might know what it would be like through detailed scientific knowledge and imagination, and this response tries to preserve both omniscience and experiential understanding by making experiential knowledge a form of imaginative or counterfactual knowledge. But again, critics argue that simulating or imagining an experience is not the same as having it, that there is a difference between knowing what it would be like and knowing what it is like, and God's simulated ignorance is not real ignorance and does not provide the experiential knowledge that the paradox concerns. The omniscience paradox also raises questions about divine immutability, the claim that God does not change, because if God learns or discovers anything, then God changes, gains knowledge that was previously lacking, and this violates immutability, and so perfect knowledge seems to require having always known everything, never learning, never being surprised, and yet this static, eternal knowledge seems incompatible with understanding temporal beings who do learn and are surprised, and reconciling omniscience and immutability with understanding human experience remains a challenge for classical theology. The paradox extends beyond ignorance to other experiential states. Does God know what it is like to be tempted, to feel desire for something forbidden, to struggle with moral choice? And if God is perfectly good, necessarily good, then God cannot be genuinely tempted, cannot feel the pull of evil, and so there is an aspect of human moral experience that God cannot know from the inside, and this creates distance between divine and human experience, suggests that God's understanding of humanity is necessarily incomplete, necessarily limited by God's perfection? And this is ironic, that God's perfection prevents complete understanding, that to fully know what it is like to be human, God would have to be imperfect, would have to experience weakness and ignorance and temptation, and these are incompatible with divine perfection. Some theologians embrace this limitation, argue that God's knowledge is perfect for a perfect being, but does not include the experiential knowledge of imperfection. And this is not a defect but a feature, a reflection of God's nature. And just as we do not think a perfect circle is defective because it is not a square, we should not think God is defective because God does not know what ignorance feels like, because such knowledge is incompatible with perfection. And the paradox assumes that all knowledge is good and more knowledge is always better. But perhaps some kinds of knowledge are only available through imperfection, and lacking them is not a limitation but a consequence of being perfect. Others reject omniscience entirely, argue that it is an incoherent concept, that complete knowledge is impossible, that there are always things that cannot be known, experiential states that require imperfection, future free choices that are not yet determined, logical truths that exceed any finite or infinite mind's capacity to grasp all at once. And if omniscience is impossible, then God is not omniscient, but this does not diminish God, does not make God less than perfect, because perfection means having all attributes that it is possible to have, not having impossible attributes. And omniscience, like omnipotence, when examined carefully, turns out to be impossible. And so God is not omniscient, but maximally knowledgeable, knows everything that can be known, and this is sufficient for divinity. God stands outside time, knowing all facts, all truths, all possibilities, and yet there is a gap, an experiential gap. God does not know what it feels like to search, to wonder, to be wrong, to learn. And whether this gap is a limitation or a feature remains contested, and the omniscience paradox persists, challenging the coherence of divine attributes, forcing clarification of what knowledge means, what kinds of knowledge exist, and whether complete knowledge is even possible. And the paradox remains unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a reminder that even the most basic divine attributes, even the claim that God knows everything, conceal complexities and contradictions that philosophy continues to explore.